My name is John Hyatt, and I live in Jackson, Michigan. The question I had was, is Jackson, Michigan actually the birthplace of the Republican Party? There are signs on the city limits in a couple places in Jackson as you go into the city that says, birthplace of the Republican Party. Now, it doesn't say the birthplace of the Republican Party.
What does it mean, and what does it look like when you create a political party? Where and how is such a thing birthed? Maybe you're imagining a basement where a select few gather to take on a political mission. Or some sort of town hall where political leaders have gotten together to hash out a cool new name for their party. Or maybe you're imagining a classroom in Ripon, Wisconsin. It was there in the winter of 1854 at the Little White Schoolhouse that dozens of enraged citizens met with an idea to form a new party. But that was it, an idea. And then a few months later, like-minded folks met under the oaks in Jackson, Michigan, and they gave this idea a platform and a name, the Republican Party.
As we talked a lot about here in Jackson, the Historical Society is in Wisconsin. They came up with the idea of forming this new party in the schoolhouse, but they had no candidates. And that's what we talk about in Jackson, is when they held that first convention in Jackson, that's where they put forth their slate of candidates. That's where they had a group, an idea, a body.
This is On Hand, a podcast that's here to answer all of your questions about all of the things that make us uniquely Michigander. I'm April Baer. Today, is Jackson, Michigan truly the birthplace of the Republican Party? On Hand producer Mike Blank has been digging through the historical trenches to get more details on this claim. Mike, hi.
Hello.
So did you know about Jackson's claim to being the birthplace of the Republican Party?
As a history nerd, yes, I did. I got really into the Civil War when I was young, about in the third grade after a family trip to Gettysburg. And I started reading everything I could about the Civil War. And I remember later that year, my mom was like, hey, there's a Civil War muster in Jackson, which was nearby our spot in the Irish Hills. And I was like, let's go check it out. And
right. The musters are like those reenactments,
yeah,
right?
Yeah. And as a young kid, that's really cool.
Yeah.
And that's the era I heard about Jackson being the birthplace of the Republican Party.
Okay, so were you aware of Ripon, Wisconsin's claim to this title?
No, I was not aware. In fact, I didn't know about it until I saw a news piece before the 2024 GOP convention in Milwaukee that was, in Wisconsin. So I had never heard of Ripon or anything. So I was like, what?
Man, so what was your reaction?
My Michi brain blew a gasket. Not only did they say this birthplace was Ripon, Wisconsin, Jackson was not even mentioned in this piece.
Oh, come on.
I should note that I'm a biased Michigander and I grew up in the Irish Hills, which is just south of the Jackson County line. So I'm doubly biased.
So do you think that Jackson should be recognized as the birthplace of the GOP?
Yeah, I do. And I'm not alone. We spoke with Jackson Historical Society President Maurice Imhoff. We heard him a little bit earlier. And here's what he had to say.
You can look at our signage, birthplace of the Republican Party, the historical markers, even American presidents and vice presidents have visited the site through the years. Unfortunately, we saw this shift where all of a sudden Wisconsin went back to being the main goal. I mean, and presidents, vice presidents, et cetera, stopped visiting Jackson and stopped visiting the site. And the site has almost gone unknown a little bit, unfortunately. And people nationally should know this.
And the other thing is, Jackson was pretty much all in on the abolitionist movement. And the abolitionist movement led to the formation of the Republican Party. Jackson also would contribute a lot to the Union during the Civil War.
When the American Civil War starts, in April of 1861, Fort Sumter is attacked, and Governor Blair is having an emergency meeting with his team in downtown Jackson at one of the local halls. And the Jackson Grays, a local militia of really young boys, march in and render their services to the governor, becoming the first troops in the entire state to offer to go fight in this national conflict. They stood up, these young men stood up and said, we want to offer our services to put an end to what is going on in the South. And throughout the 1860s, through the war, we continuously see that through men and women getting involved. I mean, you had Camp Jackson, where about 2,000 troops learned to become a soldier. You had the women of the community who were gathering supplies, giving it to the people at Camp Jackson, sending it down to the war front to support the boys who were out fighting. They understood the cause that was at hand here.
Mike, did Maurice have anything to say about whether it would mean anything to give Jackson that kind of credit?
Yes, for so many reasons, but I think Maurice really sums it up.
When I talk about this, especially as a young Black man in America, this was a spot in Michigan. And not just in Michigan, not just in Jackson. This was a spot nationally, this Oak Grove, where people said slavery is wrong. We need to stop letting it happen. We need to get together. And these are white men, mind you. And so this needs to come to an end, and called for that change. And that happened right here in our state. And that's why I feel people strongly need to learn this history.
Mike, thank you so much for all this research.
No problem. This has been an absolute blast. I love digging through the historical trenches.
When we return, a Jackson author and historian breaks down exactly how it went down at the first ever Republican convention. So what exactly happened in Jackson, Michigan in the mid-1800s that led to the formation of a major political party? We're going to take you there today with author, historian, and vice president of the Jackson, Michigan Historical Society, Linda Haas.
If you could stroll downtown, which was called Main Street, on an average 1854 day, you would probably hear the clip-clop of horses' hoofs against a gravel road. They would be bringing creaky old wooden wagons behind them. You would see men wearing bowler hats, tipping their hats to the ladies. Some might be wearing hoop skirts. A lot of the activities would be religious-oriented. A lot of the people in Jackson at that time came from the New England states, so they brought with them a focus on education and reform. So these were the kinds of social activities that were happening at that time in Jackson. It happened to have just a core group of passionate Underground Railroad activists and newspaper writers and editors, so that was also flavoring the social scene as well. Slavery was a topic that was on everyone's tongues at that time, so that just a sampling of the sights and the sounds and the topics that would have been important to Jacksonians in the 1850s.
Linda has spent decades researching Jackson County history, and when it comes to the question of Jackson having the rightful claim of being the birthplace of the Republican Party, she has dug deep. And what she's found could arguably close the case on all other contenders for all time. Linda, we've mentioned the meeting in Ripon, Wisconsin earlier, and that happened on February 28th of 1854. Does the historical record tell us anything about how quickly the word got to Jackson about this discussion about a proposed new party? Or were Jacksonians, as far as you can tell, already thinking along similar lines?
There is no evidence that Ripon's party of a couple dozen people who met in a local schoolhouse ever made a ripple outside of Ripon. If it did, I can't find it. I searched the archives for any reference in a Jackson newspaper about the Ripon meeting, keying in the words Alvin Bovee, who called the meeting, the founder of the party, as well as Republican convention, as well as, Bovee, Ripon, the whole thing. There was nothing. It didn't even make a ripple. And I'm not sure how much people outside of Ripon in Wisconsin were even aware of it at the time. Later, decades later, Alvin Bovee wrote about it, and we have his word as he's reflecting back on it. But there was no evidence in Jackson that they were even aware of this meeting. Interestingly, a year before Ripon's meeting, February of 1853, a full year before, the Free Soil Party held a convention in Jackson for the purpose of abolishing slavery, drawing people from other political parties together, calling on them to abandon their political parties and to form a fusion party. This is a year before Ripon's meeting ever happened.
Wow.
And this was an actual official meeting, not just an unofficial couple dozen people meeting in a schoolhouse. This was a year before Ripon. And that did make the newspaper reports, not only in Jackson, but in the state of Michigan. Unfortunately, the Free Soil Convention that had this very, good idea of forming a fusion party to fight slavery never did anything with it. It never got beyond the conception stage. But I will say that Jackson had this happening and on their radar a year before Ripon did anything. So, we predate Ripon by actually over a year. And interestingly, a lot of the men, it was men at that time, who planned this Free Soil Party wanting a fusion party, switched parties a year later, those same people, to plan the Republican Party. So they brought that fervor with them, and they brought with them a lot of anti-slavery Whigs and anti-slavery Democrats and everything. But this meeting seemed to be a precursor of what was going to happen in Jackson a year later.
Who were the folks who got the ball rolling in Jackson, the movers and shakers who decided to stage their convention in Jackson that summer?
I'm glad you said folks, because it wasn't a single individual. Indeed, it was men again, but it was plural. A group of former Free Soilers, former Liberty Party, anti-slavery Whigs, anti-slavery Democrats, but in particular, the specific people that were the real movers and shakers of this convention. I guess we'd have to put Austin Blair up at the top. He is a Jackson area lawyer. He also ended up being most famously Michigan's Civil War governor. He was one of the major planners of the Republican Party. I'm going to tell you a guy that almost no one talks about, and he was one of the major guys. If you do any historical research, you're going to find out about Charles DeLand. Charles DeLand was the editor of the anti-slavery paper, Charles DeLand, editor of the American Citizen. So his editorials kind of set an agenda of what to talk about amongst folks. And like I said, they were very passionate. But not only did he write these editorials, he campaigned anti-slavery editors around the state of Michigan in favor of this collective party. They didn't know what it would be named. He went to them personally and he said, this is why we need a party that's going to stand against slavery, and you need to write about it in your editorials. And then when this idea was approved, he is the guy that printed from his personal press, because he owned a paper, 1,000 notices that were distributed throughout the state of Michigan telling people when and where this event was. It was because of his circulars that he printed that people were even aware of it to come here. Seymour Treadwell, who was another Jackson abolitionist, he founded Michigan's second earliest abolition newspaper, the Michigan Freeman. Charles DeLand and Seymour Treadwell were newspaper editors by day, but they were Underground Railroad activists by night, harboring freedom seekers in their homes and transporting them to the next stop, generally Ann Arbor and then Detroit. Another mover and shaker was Jacob Howard, and he was a Detroit attorney and I think he was a former congressman, but he was a real big mover and shaker, and he had a lot of political gravitas to lend to this convention. So those are some of the main people.
Did these organizers have any sense how many people might show up once they started posting the flyers?
They had no idea. They had no idea. They booked Bronson Hall. Bronson Hall can hold 200. So we suspect from that they were thinking, gosh, if we got 200 people, this would be a good deal. It's kind of like fishing. You don't know what you're going to pull up, right? Charles DeLand circulated these 1,000 circulars. We'll book a hall for 200 people. Boy, if we get 200, that'll be a really good thing. Well,
and then what actually happened the day of?
Well, the day before, 5,000 people had already come into Jackson. Jackson had only had about 5,000 people in all of it, so it was bulging at the seam. By the next day, some estimates were that there were up to 10,000 people that
Oh,
were swelling Jackson. Because I mean to tell you, this topic just struck a passionate chord in people. They were willing to come long distances. Just to give you an idea, there was a delegation of 20 that traveled on horseback over 100 miles. Consider riding on a horse for over 100 miles. You know, in all kinds of weather. I don't know how many days it took them to get here just to come for this. You had people coming on foot. You had people coming in wagon, obviously accessing the trains, which was a real facilitator in bringing people into this convention. But they had no idea how many people they were going to hold. And it is so hilarious how it ended up. Because here's this little tiny Bronson Hall holding 200. You've got 9,000 people outside banging on the windows, pounding on the doors, saying, we did not travel on horseback 100 miles to come all the way to this thing to be shut out of this meeting that we came here for.
and so that's how things moved under the oaks, as the sign says.
That is exactly what happened. They wisely chose to adjourn it so that it could encompass all the people that came to this thing. They walked 1.5 miles west of Bronson Hall, which is in the heart of downtown Jackson. They walked an easy 1.5 miles west to an acre called, it's called various names, Morgan's 40. It was owned by a farmer with the last name of Morgan. Today we call it Under the Oaks. But it was the perfect spot for a crowd this big because it was an open field that could hold a lot of people. Speakers were at the top of a mound, which made it very nice to see who was talking. You're sitting on a grassy surface if you want to sit down, and it was shaded by over 100 mature oak trees on a hot July day. So it was a perfect spot, could accommodate everybody. It was shady, it was accessible. And this is the spot where the meeting was reconvened around 2:00 on that same day.
It's such a cinematic thing to think about, all those people settling under the oaks. But I also just have to wonder, do you know if once everybody moved into the park, was there very much debate about what this party was going to stand for?
Surprisingly, there was not. I have read every piece of evidence that I can find. And it is interesting. I can see how you would think that because you've got former free soilers, you've got Liberty Party people saying, oh, we want the Liberty slogan. No, we want the free soil slogan. No, the Whigs are saying, no, we want the Whig, No. Anti-slavery was so passionately at the forefront of everybody's heart and mind that they all said, if you're willing to get on this board, we're going to all work together. And so there was not much debate about what the party would stand for. And as an example, a subcommittee broke off of the movers and shakers that were doing this. A subcommittee of lawyers and politicians broke off, and they held a meeting to say, we're going to draft the platform that this party stands on, and we're going to do it here in this little spot away from the noisy crowd. And they did. They deliberated for quite a while, coming up with what the planks of the party would be. Then they went back to the convention. They read the resolution that they had just drafted to everyone, and the resolution was unanimously approved. And an eyewitness and an attendee and a planner of the event, Charles DeLand, wrote, frequent outbursts of applause were heard as there was unanimous adoption of the platform. Then a ticket of candidates who would represent this new party was proposed and accepted unanimously. The convention completed its labors harmoniously, and the ticket of candidates was unanimously accepted. It was over in a day.
Jeez.
The meeting began at 10:30 in the morning. They adjourned it at 1. They reconvened it at 2, and they finished before dark.
Given that we do have several sites across the country that like to claim some bona fides in the history of the Republican Party, do you think Jackson has the right to call itself the true birthplace of the party?
Yes. And let me turn the question around to, if I may, just oblige me for a minute. If you had to come up with 2 qualifiers for a legitimate national political party, something that party would need to have in order to be a legitimate party, what would you say?
Well, it's got to have a platform, and I suppose it's got to have a way of selecting candidates.
Awesome. I've looked at a variety of sources that have thoughts on what is it that qualifies an organization as being a legitimate national political party. And they mentioned three things, and you just mentioned two. One is a platform that explains the beliefs, the positions. What is it that defines your party? The other is an organizational outline. When are the meetings going to be? What's the funding coming in to make this party possible? And I would say that a third thing is candidates. Imagine trying to convince the American electorate that you have a legitimate national political party when you don't offer them any candidates to vote for in a democracy where voting is the hallmark of our government. No candidates to vote for, no vote. No vote, you can't really say you're a political party in a democracy. So now, what would you say if I told you that Ripon's little informal meeting of 24 people had none of those three things? Either platform, either candidate, or organizational outline.
I mean, when you put it that way, it's hard to argue against.
Let's just put that aside. As convincing as that is, let's put that aside. Let's look at Ripon's application to the National Register of Historic Places and see what they say about Jackson. And I'm going to read it to you because it's just one sentence.
Please do.
Yep, this is from Ripon's application. Quote, "In fairness to the Jackson Assembly, it would seem that the elements of a party phenomenon, nominees for office, adoption of a platform, committees, are more clearly evident in the Jackson meeting." End quote. So if I was in a court of law, I would kind of end my case right there. When your rival in your competition says that you have the better argument, it kind of doesn't get better than that. But I would go one step further and say, how do you define birth? And how is that different than conception? What Ripon had was an agreement of a conception of an idea. They agreed that slavery was wrong and they had to do something about it. It would be good to come up with a party that could do that. They agreed on a name that had already been in circulation for 100 years or so. They agreed on those two things. Good concepts. But how I define birth is you're bringing forth something tangible into the world above and beyond the conception of an idea. Something tangible, like candidates, like a platform, like an organizational outline. And Jackson's meeting was the first time that those things were birthed. And I will say that in the North, there were dozens of meetings bubbling up all around the place, New York, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, that made anti-slavery the focus of their meetings, and in concept wanted a new party. But there's only one place that actually brought forth something tangible to effect change and to move the needle. And that is how I define birth. You're bringing forth something tangible, not just the conception of an idea, as good as that is.
Linda Haas is the author of Hidden History of Jackson County and 6 other titles telling the stories of Jackson history. Thank you so much, Linda, for talking to us. We really appreciate the detail on the true birth of the Republican Party.
It has been a pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about it.
So, there is your definitive word on the Jackson, Michigan GOP origin story. We want to thank listener John Hyatt for asking. Do you have a story to tell about your connection with Michigan's politics? Maybe you shook John Conyers' hand? Or your mom dated Jerry Ford in college? You can email us your stories or more questions about Michigan. The address is onhand@michiganpublic.org. Email's great, but if you want to get fancy and record a voice memo and email it to us, that's nice too. Today's episode of On Hand was produced by Mike Blank. Other producers on our show are Ronia Kabansag, Michelle Jokish-Polo, April Van Buren, and our show's senior producer, Mercedes Mejia. Our executive producer is Laura Weber-Davis. I'm April Bayer, coming to you from the state that gave you the political party that ended slavery. We'll see you next time.